So the government's been making it clear that it consulted and consulted widely before bringing things to a head as it has today. One of the people it consulted was the Greens leader, Richard Di Natale, who's back with us in the studio. Senator, just take us through some of the mechanics. Obviously, the government's brought it out in the form of legislation today. When was the deal done from your point of view? At what point were you able to indicate to the government that you were broadly on board?
Oh, look, we presented our position last week. We made it really clear what our options were in terms of sensible reform. The key thing was to put power back in the hands of voters, take it away from backroom preference dealers and abolish those group voting tickets that really just benefit those backroom operators. We made it clear that we wanted to protect small parties by allocating preferences 1 to 6 above the line. We made it clear we didn't want any membership changes so that it would be harder for a party to register.
Yeah, and why was that? Just on that latter point, that's something that was omitted here but was recommended by the parliamentary inquiry. Is that self-preservation for the Greens?
No, we've got many more members than satisfy that requirement. No, we don't want any barriers for small parties to come in. This would have raised the barriers for small parties to contest an election, and we don't think that's fair. What we do think is fair, though, is that in the end, a voter should determine their preference, that a voter's wishes at the ballot box should be reflected in the outcome. We don't have that at the moment. We have these sort of backroom deals where you can vote for the pro-climate change party, you elect the anti-climate change party, or vice versa. You have someone elected on 0.5%. Someone who gets 25% of the vote still only elects one person. The system's not working, and we wanted to see that change. Bob Brown campaigned for this back in 2004. We put our position to the government last week, and they said they'd consider it and take it to their party room. They clearly have, and they've supported our recommendations.
Sure. So you say it's a consistent position that the Greens have held for some time, and you don't want to put barriers up to entry, but isn't there an exclusionary effect by removing preferences the way they used to be allocated? There are not going to be the fields of candidates that we've had running in the Senate in recent years.
At the moment, we've got somebody who can have 4 or 5 front parties. You can be a registered officer for 4 or 5 different parties. They're not real parties. They just exist so that voters can put a vote next to their name and funnel preferences to the party that's controlled by the same person. That's not a democratic system. So no, under this system, many of the small parties who are in the Senate now would have been elected at the last election. The Greens proposed this in 2004 when our vote was half of what it is now. We only had 2 senators. The key principle is this. In a democracy, someone's vote should be reflected with the outcome of an election, and at the moment that just doesn't happen.
Did you discuss at any point in your negotiations with the government preferencing at the next election?
No.
Not in any seat, lower or upper house?
I know this might be a huge surprise to people. People assume that in these negotiations that some of these things that don't relate to the legislation are put on the table. We made it really clear. This is a long-held position, a position of principle, fundamental to any democracy, that an outcome reflects the voters' intentions. This system doesn't do it. We went in there and we said, here are our bottom lines. We walked away from that not knowing whether the government would support it. They have, and I hope what we get is a more robust, more effective and more democratic political outcome.
We're certainly not suggesting anything untoward, but because of the nature of self-regulation in this area by political parties, those discussions are going to have to be held at some point in the future.
I'm sure people inside the party will at some point be discussing preferences with all parties in the parliament, but they weren't even remotely discussed through these discussions.
All right, last time we spoke, it was your preference that the Labor Party, all of you, could end up in some sort of tripartisan position. That appears not to be going to happen. Are you prepared to weather whatever storm Labor now tries to unleash upon you?
Well, the Labor Party originally backed this reform when it came to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. They made it very clear. Gary Gray, Helen Griffin, in fact, many people privately inside the Labor Party support it. It would be disappointing if they walked away from this because they smell some sort of political opportunity. The only people who benefit from this are those backroom dealers. So if this is a way of some of those factional players to retain some power and influence at the expense of a more democratic voting system, I think that would be an indictment on the Labor Party.
Whether their fears are well founded mathematically or not, one of their fears do appear to be the possibility of a coalition majority. Is that something you have calculated or contemplated in doing the deal?
Most psephologists will tell you that that's a very unlikely scenario. The people who benefit from this, the party that benefits from this reform, is the party that people vote for. That's the difference here. The parties that will benefit most are the ones that get the most votes. Surely that's a key principle in a democracy. So very, very happy to support a democratic voting system that puts power back in the hands of voters and takes it away from those backroom operators.
All right, and the likelihood, just as an observer and participant, of a double dissolution election. Obviously, if this goes through on the timetable that the government has outlined, it's got that House in order to pull that trigger if it wanted to. You're ready and prepared for that possibility?
We are ready to go. Ultimately, it will be a decision for the Prime Minister. I mean, we'll be ready to go. We're a party that's really proud of our record, standing up for fair and decent treatment of refugees, more action on climate change, shutting down those new coal mines that are operating right around the country, making sure that we transition our economy smarter, more investment in the new economy, those things that will bring us prosperity. That's the sort of thing that we want to be discussing during this election campaign.
And I'm noting that you say this is not about advantage and disadvantage in your analysis of it, but when you've crunched numbers before, I think you've said you found swings and roundabouts plus one senator. Have you done anything about a double dissolution scenario and the Greens numbers under this voting mechanism?
It will depend on our primary vote. I mean, in the end, whether the Greens
get 12% at the moment.
Well, if we get representation, if we get 12% of the vote, then we stand a chance of picking up an additional senator. If our vote drops, we stand a chance of losing people. I mean, in a democracy, the outcome of an election should be whether people vote for you or not. That's why this is an important reform.
All right. Richard Di Natale, thanks. We'll leave it there.